Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. After Hurricane Sandy roared through New York, leaving 44 dead and billions of dollars in devastation, city leaders were forced anew to confront the crumbling and unsafe condition of our infrastructure, our streets, bridges, subways, power grid, water systems, public buildings, and seawalls. The R-Train tunnel under the East River, which flooded end to end, floor to ceiling, is still closed for an overhaul, with the G-Train tunnel closure looming ahead. Hospitals, which had their power systems and backup power at or below street level, found what had seemed to be a perfectly rational decision decades ago now left them subject to destructive flooding. There are public housing developments in outlying areas where thousands of residents still rely on temporary boilers to provide heat and water. The civic consensus is that renovating or replacing that infrastructure is no longer an option, but a must. The average age of our leaky water mains is 69 years. Gas mains average 56 years old, as we learned the hard way in March following a deadly explosion in East Harlem. 370 of the city's 1,200 schools predate the Great Depression. Homeless shelters average 70 years old, hospitals 57, and more than 3 in 5 courthouses predate 1941. That is the $47 billion question, as outlined in a, no pun intended, groundbreaking study released last month by the Center for an Urban Future entitled Caution Ahead. The author of that report is with us tonight. The question is, how do we upgrade our city to allow it to prosper or even survive in the 21st century? In what order do we make those upgrades? And perhaps most vexing, how do we pay for it? We already pay 14 cents of every tax dollar collected to bondholders before we ever spend a dime to hire a police officer, teacher, or sanitation workers, or I guess since we're on CUNY TV, college professor. There are, in fact, lots of proposals for financing, ranging from pay-as-you-go schemes to scaling back some costly construction union protections to a resurrected congestion pricing system, including tolls on the East River bridges. A crisis should force us to confront a civic agenda that has always been before us, but is now more compelling than ever. Kevin Dwarka is a land use attorney and former Baruch College instructor who specializes in the revitalization of urban neighborhoods. Adam Forman is a research associate at the Center for an Urban Future and the principal author of its Caution Ahead report. Alex Matthiessen is president of the Blue Marble Project and campaign director for Move New York, which works to address twin problems of traffic congestion and transit infrastructure needs. And Owen Gutfreund is a professor of urban affairs and planning at Hunter College. Adam, let me start with you. You wrote this report. It's gotten a lot of attention. $47 billion is really designed to kind of build up what we already have. It doesn't even talk about expanding what we need.
Exactly. That's just for replacement and rehabilitation of existing infrastructure, not for new projects. It also doesn't include water and sewer system. If we added those, it'd be well into the $50 billion.
But I mean, what was the obviously the motivation was partly after Sandy, but this is a much longer standing.
Yeah, absolutely. So Hurricane Sandy certainly motivated us to look into this report. It was the first time in a long while that politicians really put infrastructure on the top of their agenda, and we were motivated to take that policy window and provide an opportunity to identify problems not just associated with Hurricane Sandy, not just resiliency, but also in our infrastructure system throughout our sewer systems, our water systems, our transportation systems, buildings, utilities. And what we found is not that surprising. New York City's infrastructure is very old. We have over 1,000 miles of water mains over 100 years old, over 160 bridges, over 160 school buildings over 100 years old. And when you have old infrastructure, you need to replace it, you need to rehabilitate it constantly. It takes a lot of money for state of good repair, money that we haven't always been investing. Mayor Bloomberg did a fantastic job increasing the capital budget, but at times we saw that he was investing in new infrastructure rather than replacing existing infrastructure, particularly with sewer mains, water mains, and roads. We actually saw a decline in the conditions of those infrastructure systems.
Alex, Move New York has kind of focused in and has been involved in the development of a new congestion pricing proposal to kind of pay for a lot of the transit improvements and kind of helping us move around this very, very crowded city. It kind of flamed out the last time. There's always politics connected to policy. I know this is a shocking thing, but I mean, tell us how this developed and where we are now.
Well, let me just say I'm very grateful for the work that Adam and the Center for an Urban Future have done, because the first step towards solving a problem and coming up with a solution, of course, is to identify that you actually have a problem.
This is a psychological point.
Yes, this is a psychological point and a political one, actually. And so it's great that they've written this report, and I'm so pleased that they're getting as much attention as they are. It's really critical that they do. So yes, we have resurrected a plan to address the infrastructure needs, particularly in the transportation sector. You referred to it as congestion pricing. We don't use that term for a variety of reasons, but part of the reason, the main reason, is that the congestion pricing piece, if there is such a thing in our plan, which there is a very small part of a much bigger plan that's much more extensive than what was known as congestion pricing as proposed a couple of years ago. But in a nutshell, the basic proposition is we would create a toll swap where we would lower tolls dramatically by almost 50% on the 7 MTA bridges in the outer parts of the city. So the Queensboro, the Triborough, the Whitestone, the Verrazano, the Cross Bay bridges, Gil Hodges, et cetera, in return for putting tolls on bridges that used to be tolled, the East River bridges 100 years ago, but haven't been tolled in a long time. And by doing a rebalancing, essentially, a rejiggering of the region's tolling system, by simply being fair, in other words, if you're going to drive across a bridge or through a tunnel, you should pay. Everybody pays, but making it fair so people in the outer parts of the city aren't paying quite so much and people in the inner parts of the city are paying something. By simply doing that, you would generate $1.5 billion a year in revenue. And if you bond that revenue, which is, by the way, the best way to protect it and make sure it actually gets spent on transportation revenue infrastructure, you actually can protect it as well. But that's basically, with this plan, you could generate up to $20 billion or more in the next 5 years to invest in our transportation infrastructure.
Kevin, you've done a lot of work in kind of urban development. Infrastructure improvements are always something that we put off until tomorrow. I think the argument that the report makes is that tomorrow has come. So, I mean, what's different now? Is there an opportunity now?
I think there's a great opportunity here, and one of the aspects of the report that I was really pleased to see was to call out the importance of bringing our existing infrastructure into a state of good repair. There's a lot of political support for some incredibly ambitious projects, and you can see why politically they capture the attention and the imagination of the public. But I do think sometimes the projects that require maintenance improvements disappear from the political radar, and I think this report really helps to bring them into relief. Now, with regard to the synergy between bringing the infrastructure into a state of good repair and urban revitalization, I think what's key here is to look at the degree to which cities like New York are making a comeback. These are not cities, our major cities are growing in population. People want to be living in higher density, transit-oriented environments. And so we have this incredible opportunity now to really channel new growth and development in the places that are most primed for sustainable development, which would be our neighborhoods in New York City. But we can't accommodate that growth if we don't fix our infrastructure. So, you know, when it comes back to the question of state of good repair, I see this as so interlinked with neighborhood revitalization and growth in the city. This is where we want to spend our dollars here, as opposed to making investments in more exurban areas, new capital infrastructure. It may be politically more palatable in certain cases, but from a sustainability perspective, from an urban perspective, I think preserving, maintaining, improving what we already have in New York City could go a long way for regional sustainability.
Owen, you've looked at urban politics in this city for an awful long time. Kind of a little bit of the same question I asked Kevin. What's different this time? And because we are talking about $47 billion just to kind of get us back to even, let alone the kinds of expansions that we're talking about expanding the number 7 train, completing the 2nd Avenue subway, the kind of affordable housing proposals that, the mayor has been talking about. What's different now?
Well, I think the biggest thing that's different this time, because of course we have been here before, the most notable example being in the 1970s when literally we had trucks and cars flowing through our highways and landing on the ground underneath, and highways being closed and crumbling and falling and being taken down. What's different this time is that capital is flowing into New York City. We are in a position of strength. We just don't seem to have the political will to tap into that. We managed to make it through the last infrastructure crisis of 20 years of deferred maintenance, which is what this problem is. 20 years worth of deferred maintenance from the 50s and 60s into the early 70s. We made it through that with imposed fiscal discipline and devoting new tax revenues to bonding to be able to start catching up. And we did that in a position of our lowest point in New York City's financial history. We have some strength now. We just need to be willing to say, if we're going to spend the money we need to spend, it will not come out of the ether. We actually need to tax, but we can do it in the right way. User fees that are fair, bonding them in an environment where interest rates are so low. This is the ideal time to be borrowing billions of dollars and pay it back over 20 or 30 years and make sure you spend it on infrastructure that will last that long. We can do this. It would be good to bring back something like a commuter tax, which we had.
But that's not
in
politically feasible.
We did it once.
Yes.
It's not politically feasible in this environment, but the bottom line is we can't do this without spending money, and we can't spend money if we don't collect it from somewhere. We can collect it either from the people that use the infrastructure or from taxes, which is a way of collecting it from everybody that benefits from it. And even though neither one of those things is political candy, it's better than being mayor when the city falls apart.
And the report, which I recommend to everybody, you can find it on the Center for an Urban Future website, deals with the issue of financing, of how you pay for it. I must say you don't shy away from it, and you kind of go after some fairly controversial things, even kind of scrapping or changing the scaffold law. The scaffold law, which dates back to the 19th century, I believe, is essentially, in various forms, essentially makes a contractor liable for injuries to workers on work sites. And, even if, as contractors argue, it could be the worker could be totally negligent. And you also saw, we also saw this week reports that the city's construction unions are in discussion with Mayor de Blasio's administration on the construction of affordable housing, of not charging a full union wage, because you would wind up in the situation of market rate housing being built union and affordable housing, of market rate housing being built non-union and affordable housing being built union, which would be kind of a backwards way of costing. Is there a flexibility? Is this, in terms of the financing of this, are these all big lifts, heavy lifts? Are they doable? Is there a consensus around the financing? This seems to me there's easier to have a consensus around what we need than it is to how to pay for it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think user fees is really a good example of an area where not only do you create a new income source, but you actually reduce stress on the infrastructure as well. So lots of big trucks and lots of cars are going over the Brooklyn Bridge rather than going through tunnels.
The trucks can't go over the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh, not excuse me.
Right.
But cars, and you have, absolutely. So cars are going over there more than, and it leads to a lot of congestion. That's the heavy weight on the bridge, which leads to a quicker degradation of those bridges. If we actually had those bridges tolled, you would create an incentive to go over other forms of transit, the other bridges or other tunnels. So user fees actually disincentivize the overuse of some of our existing assets, which leads to a longer lifespan. So that's really important. And there's lots of other user fees that could have a similar benefit. For instance, we recommend charging communications companies to put up cell sites or little cell towers on street lights, on traffic signals. That would not only create a new income source for the city where we can charge those companies, but also would increase cell reception and mobile broadband. So I think there's a lot of ways we can both increase revenue and improve our infrastructure.
I've always believed the original congestion pricing, and by the way, just jump in, I don't need to be the center of this discussion. I've always believed that the original congestion pricing was always a stalking horse for tolls on the bridges, and which is kind of a third rail of politics in New York. I also remember when this was first proposed, one of the times it was proposed 25 years ago, Howard Golden was then the borough president of Brooklyn, said, I'll go along with tolls of bridges as long as you put the toll booths in Manhattan. You take the mess. Obviously now with Easy Pass and now the technological shift, it's a lot, it's a lot less of a problem. Our outer borough people, and pardon my use of that term since I'm a Brooklyn boy, I find it offensive, are outer borough people going to accept the idea of tolling the bridges?
Increasingly they are. I mean, they really are. The response we're getting is overwhelmingly positive, and a lot of folks who were previous opponents of the congestion pricing plan have actually signed on to support our plan. And there's a couple reasons why. And one of the things I want to say too is that the very first thing that Sam Schwartz, Gridlock Sam Schwartz and I and others did before we even came up with a plan was looked very carefully at the Bloomberg effort, the plan itself and the campaign that they pursued to try and build support for it. And we learned a lot of lessons from that. But one of the reasons that the folks in the outer boroughs, the other boroughs, are much more receptive to this idea is because it's much fairer. The previous plan was seen as very Manhattan-centric, very kind of catered to the wealthy who live in Manhattan. This one's much fairer, and here's why. First of all, you're not just tolling East River bridges. This is really an important point because that becomes a stalking horse, as you said. We're also tolling across 60th Street, and the reason is that it would be unfair to only place a new toll on the East River bridges, thus putting a fee on folks from Queens and Brooklyn and Long Island, and not tolling the more than 50% of the people who are coming into the central business district who actually come from the north, from New Jersey, Westchester, Connecticut, et cetera. So that's the way of creating fairness. Secondly, because we're lowering tolls in the outer parts of the city, that also is perceived as much fairer because folks in the outer boroughs are the ones that typically use those tolls out there as well. And I want to say one thing that's really important, which is that it's a hard issue because if you want to try and kill congestion pricing, what you do is you complain about a new toll on these river bridges. First of all, and you'll say, they've been free, they should be free, that's a right of birth. But the fact is they weren't originally free, they were all tolled, all 4 bridges. And secondly, you just have to ask yourself a simple question. Why is it fair for anyone to drive over a free bridge when everybody else in the region is paying? Either to cross, either to cross the bridges in the outer parts of the city, or to pay for their Long Island Railroad, or their Metro North, or their bus, or their subway ticket. Everybody else is paying to come into this part of the city.
But it's also
so
the
not
case
fair for certain people to pay
if you want to
nothing.
talk about a history lesson, and I may be wrong on this, but I don't believe I am, is that the original purpose of tolls was to pay off the bonds that were used to build the bridge. And the idea was that once that bridge was paid off, those tolls were supposed to be removed. And of course now tolls are used to cross-subsidize all kinds of things. Yes.
I'm gonna, yeah, you're more than half right, but not
half.
entirely
Well, that's
right.
better than I usually am.
And the missing piece is the really important one that we're talking about here. What the tolls were meant to do was to pay off the bonds and
Maintain.
and accumulate a replacement reserve, which is, it's that second part that we didn't do. So all over the country, we've removed tolls after we pay off the bonds, and then all of a sudden we have no revenues to maintain it. And as a practical matter, why should it be free when it costs money to maintain and replace?
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I also want to point out one thing about this. The fact that it's called congestion pricing is one of the biggest problems, because if we called it new alternatives for New Yorkers to get around the city, that would be different. But what we call it is something that says it's all about being stuck in traffic and we're going to make you pay for it.
Right.
And instead what it is we're trying to figure out a way to even the load and produce choices that actually are good choices. One of the problems that people complain about is that I don't want to have to pay more money and that's the only way I can get there. If we give them another way to get there and they have to pay for both of them, that becomes a different situation.
I'd like to add the land use piece to the congestion pricing, or is there another, what should I refer to it
fair
as?
tolling.
The fair tolling. Fair tolling.
tolling plan.
You've raised
Pardon my use of the word.
a wonderful question about, well, is fair tolling at the point in which it pays off the amount of debt that needs to be paid off, does it no longer have a function and utility? And I would argue it absolutely does. And again, from the urban sustainability perspective, when we allow roads to be open and to not be charged, we're not recovering the full social and environmental costs of vehicular usage. In New York City, more growth can be accommodated, but can we do it if we actually do not assess and monetize the actual costs of driving in the city? What is the effect of these types of pricing structures on the switching from driving to taking transit, for example? If there is no pricing for cars, what are
Well,
the
we do already
implications for
pay for
transit
cars.
usage?
We pay in gas taxes. So I mean, we are to some degree monetizing people.
But it's only a fraction. It only covers a fraction of those costs, and nonetheless, you still can't get around the fact that something like 750,000 trips every day are crossing into the central business district for free, while everybody else is paying through the nose. I mean, people who are driving across the Whitestone or the Throgs Neck of the Verrazano, they're paying $15 cash round trip, 1066 Easy Path, and effectively they're subsidizing the rest of the drivers who are paying nothing. So all we're saying is
They're also subsidizing the transit system.
and they're subsidizing the transit system, but also when I talk to car drivers, most of them who are thinking about this are actually happy to subsidize the transit system because they understand that the better the system is and the better it operates and the faster it goes and the safer it is,
Better
the
for them.
faster it gets you to work, the fewer people are going to get off of the subway and get back in their car because they're frustrated with the transit system and then clog roads. So even drivers appreciate the cross-subsidization.
That's the point. It's a decongestion pricing, not congestion pricing.
Exactly.
It's one of the
Except
ways
that
in
it's
which
also, as a social matter, this is the old, somewhere buried deep in me is the old lefty. It's also using price as a means of social control. And so, I mean, and that's always been kind of a...
I think that's true. I mean, and that's the point I was making before. When you toll a bridge, people aren't going to use it less, and therefore it doesn't become overburdened. I think social control is an ugly word. I think it's more about incentives and disincentives. This is very capitalistic, actually, rather than social control and all the intonations that entails. I think it's a matter of, we can disincentivize the overuse of infrastructure, and we need to do that.
I see it as cost recovery than social control.
We're doing well with language.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
but
Semantics.
I think that the thing that we should remember is that it is all of these things, and it affects land use patterns. But by not having a toll, that too is a social inducement,
And there's a social cost.
there is.
Right,
But there's this, I don't want to throw out more jargon, but there's this idea in planning that people talk about called induced demand. If you offer something and you don't charge for it, and it has benefit, you are going to create demand because you're giving away something and not charging for it. So,
But again, going back to my original point about bonding, we have this formula. This is way too wonky, but we have a formula that there's a cap on how much we can issue bonds based on the accumulated property value in the city of New York. I don't
and we
wanna-
pay no attention to it because
well,
we have all these special
we
revenue
pay no attention to it
devices.
because every time we get close to it, we create a new bonding agency off on the side
Right.
that's not subject to that cap. But that's still real dollars. I mean, when I was a reporter in Florida and I covered the Latin American debt crisis, it shocked me to learn that the national debt actually had to be covered by taking that money out of the credit pool. I thought it was this, funny money that didn't mean anything. And the same thing with bonding.
Yeah.
That, think of, we're paying money for money. And, think of what we could do if we had lower bond costs in terms of hiring police officers, hiring teachers, hiring professors, hiring, social workers, hiring whatever. So there's a real cost in this bonding, and there does come a point at which it's too much.
And I don't think we're at that point. In 2002, before Bloomberg came in, we had total debt outstanding was 140% of revenue, was 40% higher than total city revenue. Right now, it's at about 34%. It's gone down. At some point during Bloomberg administration in 2008, it went down to over 19% greater than revenue. So we're actually at a situation where we're much better off than 2002 in terms of how much debt we have outstanding and how much revenue we're generating. I think this is actually a time where we can be
Well, they said there's
borrowing more.
I talked to a guy who works in the same building as me, runs the Financial Control Board. You were talking about from the 1970s. That's the board that, if the city is $100 million in debt at the end of any year, they can take over our finances and basically run us. It's also the kind of board that has forced discipline on New York City, because we have the most disciplined budgeting in the country. For all these people who call us this, profligate, people, we're actually a model for budgeting around. We do 4-year budgeting and 4-year financial planning, and so that we can comfortably go to 16 cents, and which is an extra 2 cents is actually billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. It's not because of what it is, but it's always caused me concern that that's money chasing money, and that because there are proposals. One of the people who was supposed to be here tonight, but she was unable to be here, Nicole Jelinas, has talked about doing pay-as-you-go development. And is that a rational, reasonable thing to try?
I do think so.
The thing is that not all debt is can be viewed the same way. And there's some things that you borrow money for that generate revenue. And by borrowing that money and building that thing, you come out ahead of where you were if you didn't take on debt. So that's one thing.
Well, clearly, if the bonding is to build up the infrastructure, that's going to allow the economy to flow. I mean, we're in the 21st century, and you need to be able to, I mean, this is a basic planning concept. You know, without infrastructure, you're in a lot of trouble. If we can't clean the water, if we can't, you know, we're in, I mean, Hurricane Sandy showed us the cost.
But the other, really what I was getting at, which is one of the things that we've done, it's not quite pay as you go, but it's an example, and I've heard Nicole talk about this before, so I know it's an example she views positively. We have the example of the stations along the number 7 line extension, where we use a value capture strategy. So by building adequate infrastructure, we are creating property value, and then we capture some of the incremental property value in order to pay for that. And it doesn't require a net addition to the city's debt, and it doesn't require additional user fees. It's actually saying, you're going to get $3 worth of value from this, so we're going to take $1 back from you, who, your property owner, and use that to build the thing that's going to give you.
We're talking about on the west side that
Yeah.
It's almost it's the similar concept of business improvement districts, which is that we're going to tax you low and use that money locally. So I mean, there are locally based taxes in that sense, and that's what this is in essence.
It is, but we don't do it often enough for infrastructure. It's also what's being done along the Brooklyn waterfront with,
Brooklyn Bridge Park.
Yeah, we'll let you build apartment buildings on land that would otherwise have no residential value because it's a park or a pier. We'll let you build apartments. It creates land value. We're going to supplementally tax that to pay for the park itself.
But we're also, I mean, it's very interesting that the mayor, who has come in committed to build 200,000 units of affordable housing. I mean, this is also part of the infrastructure that the city needs for us to be able to afford to live here, is, challenging what used to be shibboleths, that you don't mess with neighborhoods, saying you can build higher if you'll put more.
Yeah.
He's liable to run up against community boards saying that's great in some other neighborhood. He's liable to run up against some NIMBY stuff, and so he's looking to be, kind of change the way communities have controlled a lot of development in this city. I mean, the Second Avenue subway, the poor businesses along Upper Second Avenue, which have been destroyed, during this construction process, but obviously for the betterment of the city as a whole, if you look forward. So I don't know how this balance works out.
Well, I'd say over the last 10 years, from prior to the de Blasio administration, really beginning in 2002, New York City's Department of City Planning has been undertaking a very ambitious rezoning effort that has upzoned large parts of the city and enabled,
especially the waterfront.
Especially along the waterfront. Simultaneously, the Department of City Planning has also downzoned certain areas of the city in order to promote what they describe as a more contextual approach to urban design and to land use. I think it's a step in the right direction to accommodate more growth in denser neighborhoods in New York City, especially in neighborhoods where there is the New York City subway network. There's a tremendous opportunity in the outer boroughs to connect the subway via bus rapid transit. That work has been going on for a number of years through New York City Transit. I think the missing piece that came out of the rezonings was the affordability question, that as we move forward in upzoning these parts of the city, what are the implications on the overall supply of affordable housing units in the city? To what extent do the rezonings contribute to gentrification? To what extent does the increase in supply actually have, perhaps theoretically, a positive effect on the cost of housing units just based on classical economics? Here we are now, and we're having a citywide debate on how we can actually create more affordable housing through mandatory inclusionary zoning. And that may be a very powerful way of reconciling the upzoning with the affordability questions and simultaneously enabling transit-oriented neighborhoods in New York City to flourish for the next 20, 30 years. Not easy. Lots of tricky legal questions come into play with inclusionary zoning. But I think what's happening right now under this administration is a very productive debate on how should we handle the affordability question, given the fact that we've upzoned so many neighborhoods in New York City.
Also want to go back to the transit question. There's two things have jumped out at me. One is Governor Christie came in and one of the first things he did was he pulled the plug on what was called the ARC, right?
Yep.
The ARC was the train, was the additional tunnel under the Hudson River that would have carried, tens of thousands of people every day and eased pressure on PATH and New Jersey Transit for coming in. And he yanked it, making an argument about debt service. PATH trains in particular lose so much money that as part of the reform of the Port Authority in the wake of the bridge, of the Bridgegate scandal and everything else, which is forcing people, just as as we said with Sandy, a crisis can be an opportunity. There's talk about, pardon my use of the word dumping the PATH system and its debts either on the MTA or on New Jersey Transit, because these systems don't pay for themselves. And there is a significant subsidy that has to happen.
There's no transit system in the country that pays for itself, just like there's
And in fact, we
there are
pay
no highways
more,
except toll roads.
And
that
in
pay
fact,
for
we pay,
themselves.
as I understand it, we pay more through the fare box
That's true.
than almost any other system in the country.
Yep.
But it's a fallacy that we should expect transit systems to pay for themselves. We don't expect streets and roads to pay for themselves. That's
exactly
we shouldn't accept the premise that that's the way we assess it.
Yeah, no, I agree with Owen entirely. And I also just kind of want to mention quickly about something like the Move New York plan. It really is critically important that if you're going to, create a new tolling system and rebalance the existing tolling system, and thereby displace some trips and force, as Adam says, the disincentivization of certain trips, et cetera, you have to make sure you're providing replacement options for folks. And so there are way too many people who live in neighborhoods that are underserved by transit in the city, even though we've got one of the greatest transit systems and most extensive transit systems in the world. And so I think our obligation as we push this plan forward is to make sure that the money is invested first. Actually, order is important. First, we're going to take for the first time ever about a quarter of the $1.5 billion in revenues every year and put it into roads and bridges, because it's important that drivers get something back for their toll dollar. Secondly, and really critically, we have to put the next amount of money into creating more transit options around the city. And so we've got a whole 5-point plan for how you actually fill those transit gaps that still exist in too many.
But you would be filling them mainly, I would assume, through buses more than through track expansion.
Well, it's a combination. I mean, we would like to do some new projects. I mean, Penn Access, which would add 4 new Metro North
And I guess-
stations in the eastern
and out
part of the Bronx.
Taking the train out to LaGuardia, I would assume.
Yeah, exactly. Those kinds of projects we're interested in. But we really do think there's a lot of stuff, as you say, that you can, for a much smaller amount of money, not these kind of mega projects, but much smaller investments, you can actually extend the amount of service to people around the city. So a couple ideas. One, restore more of the bus service that was cut in 2010. 2, expedite the deployment of new SBS or BRT services around the city.
That BRT is Bus Rapid Transit, SBS is
exactly.
what again? It's
Select bus service.
Select bus service.
It's kind of it's like a slightly watered down version of BRT. Third, we can deploy a lot more express bus service. So if you don't have access to a subway, you can actually get an express bus into the core part of the city. 4, and this is actually a really innovative idea, which is you've got Metro North and Long Island Railroad going through some of the largest transit gaps in Queens and Brooklyn, and particularly in the Bronx. So if you simply extended city ticket, which is an MTA program whereby you get a discount on the weekends if you take one of the commuter rails from within city limits, extend that to 7 days a week, and suddenly people have an affordable option, another option for getting into the city. So there's lots of things we can do with actually relatively small investments, not the mega projects like Second Avenue Subway, to radically improve transit access around the city.
And it's the LIR line is a really interesting example. It's not even the ones that were there in Queens, but the ones that are deactivated. You have a line to the Rockaways, which there's discussion right now of turning into a park, much like the High Line. It's called the Queensway. That could be reactivated. You could send the R to the Rockaways.
Reactivated as a
rail line. As a rail line. You could send the R to the Rockaways, have another line that means to JFK, and you'd be able to extend the G to Forest Hills, so give it 3 more stops. I mean, that's being turned into a park in an area that has plenty of parks. That's not going to finance itself in the way that High Line is going to finance itself, and is transportation starved, is crazy to me. That's a great opportunity for more transit. I also want to just shift a little bit. We've been talking a lot about agreeing with revenues, and revenues obviously really critical, and we're all agreeing that more revenues need to pay for it. But let's also talk about costs. I mean, the huge cost overruns. I have almost no sympathy for Governor Christie's putting the kibosh on the Arc Tunnel. It was something that was so critical.
I agree with you.
However, when his complaint was that if there are cost overruns, I think I'm going to have to pay for it, not the federal government, not the Port Authority. And that people thought that was a crazy idea. It's absolutely true. There's huge cost overruns, whether it's $4 billion more than we expected for the East Side access, whether it's paying $1 billion more for DEP filtration plant all over the city, but especially in the transportation system, we're seeing massive cost overruns. And how do we settle that? How do we address that? We can't talk about revenue. We wouldn't need to have new revenue sources if we could actually control costs.
Aren't there other ways to we maybe need to approach the construction and contracting process differently? Look at what we're doing with the Tappan Zee Bridge,
right?
Which is a whole different way of contracting.
Project-specific arrangements.
It's project-specific, but it also is a situation where then the contractor bears the risk of the overruns. So that's another shift that we really, before we run out of time, we need to focus on. You in your intro. You went through many other kinds of infrastructure besides transportation.
Yes, please.
And the housing one in particular really concerns me because we have, this sounds kind of ridiculous to say, but actually we have a lot invested in our public housing. We have more public housing units than any other city comes close to.
I grew up in Linden houses.
And they work relative to all other public housing fairly well. But we're not spending nearly enough money on maintenance. And we are quickly going to allow our public housing stock to look just like the buildings that needed to be dynamited in most other major American cities. And it's a huge problem.
Yeah, public housing is definitely a big issue. It's going to be a $14 billion deficit at NYCHA over the next 5 years.
Except that, again, going back to my reporting days, I remember when I was at Newsday when there was the 30th anniversary of when my project opened in 1957 when we moved in. And I went back and I looked at the records, and those years in the 50s, the federal government was supporting the opening of 15,000 public housing units a year. And by the time, just in New York City. And by the time of the Reagan years, the federal government was supporting on the order of 430 new housing units. So how do you do housing absent significant federal involvement, which is how a lot of this housing has been done? And unless you have some crystal ball that's going to tell me how John Boehner in the House is going to agree to help New York on this, I'd love to hear it.
It doesn't seem as though the federal government's going to agree on anything to help anybody in any way anytime soon. But this is an important problem because relative to our housing stock, the transportation's in good shape, actually, in terms of affordable housing. We're losing affordable housing every year through this not funding the depreciation and deregulating rent-stabilized units and through gentrification. And those three processes, every year we are losing ground. I mean, that's...
Yeah, I might take
No,
this
go ahead.
question. I would agree that the preservation of affordable housing stock is key. I also think that the question about affordable housing and the access to it is more than a New York City question. It's a regional question. We have no small amount of vacant and distressed parcels that are scattered throughout the New York metropolitan area in areas that are well served by transit infrastructure. So while I don't mean to minimize the importance of New York City investing in rehabilitating its housing stock, I'd also like to say that as we are confronting issues of gentrification, it's important to look at the opportunity for revitalizing a lot of these other post-industrial cities in New Jersey along the Hudson River, places where we could provide a large amount of middle-class housing by rehabilitating housing structures that are there but have become dilapidated over several decades.
Although those Jersey cities are under the same, in some ways worse gentrification pressure than we are. Yes, sir. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
My name is Johnny DeRogin, and I go to John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I would like to understand this. I would like to understand this point that you said that the toll system, they installed them initially to pay for the bonds of the bridges, and then they and then they were supposed to be removed,
Removed, right.
and then now they stay. So the question I have is, how did they get to stay?
Well, you're the historian of this.
I
I
think
was at
that-
least half right on that.
Yes,
Right.
you were at least half right. I think that this was a difference between what the plan was and the way it was described to the American public. Often people felt as though if we're borrowing money that will take 20 years to pay back to build this bridge, then 20 years later we should get to remove the tolls. And this was on highways and it was on tolls, but as a practical matter, that was never written into the legislation. It was never a commitment. It was actually only what I would call a public misunderstanding that the politicians were willing to.
Or worse, it was a public
Enable.
understanding, and it was, I mean, you know, okay, I'm sorry, but
It was the public understanding, but it wasn't actually written into any of the enabling legislation for these tolling
Are
authorities.
you talking about just these bridges, or all the bridges?
In general, the concept of tolling is that the public understood that they were to pay back the bonds, but if you read the actual documents and the actual enabling legislation, they would always say to pay back the debt and to accumulate reserves for replacement.
Right.
And you're a historian of Robert Moses. I mean, he was very tricky in drawing up some of those contracts, where it was the tolls will be removed once the bonds are paid off, but then he had a stipulation where if he can borrow more, then he can continue to toll.
And this is where the public understanding comes from. He would say that,
Yeah,
but it was never actually written into the
exactly.
bond documents.
Yeah.
you're actually saying that Robert Moses misrepresented things. This is really,
Crazy.
this is really,
This is headline news.
this is really shocking. Yes, sir.
Yes, good evening. My name is Omar Diaz, and I go to Queens College. I just want to know how much of the rebuilding that needs to be done can be addressed by New York City alone without the help of Albany, the federal government, or the region?
I'm
wants
going
to
to take
tackle
a
that?
quick answer to that and then see what my fellow panelists
Yeah,
say.
it's a
But
good
my quick answer is just that there's somebody I know who worked in the Bloomberg administration, Rit Agarwal, who was responsible for the long-term planning, strategic planning.
Sustainability.
Yes, but he one time pointed out to me as we were debating these things, he said, we collect so much more money in New York City that we send to Albany and Washington than we get back. If they would only get out of our business, we could take care of all of it. So that's one way to look at that. But of course, that's not going to happen.
Well, but the question is, the question is, how can we do it? I mean, we have to bond more and a higher and higher percentage of the cost of a lot of these projects because we don't get that federal support. That's an added burden on us.
Yeah, absolutely true. And that $47 billion figure in terms of rehabilitating New York City's infrastructure includes CUNY, includes New York
Where,
City
by the way,
Housing
the
Authority.
average building of CUNY is 52 years old. I went through that whole long list. I got all this data, by the way, from the report, which
Yeah.
again I recommend.
And there's a $2 billion deficit in CUNY buildings. You know, it needs a lot of infrastructure investments, especially in the community colleges, where it depends more on city funding than the senior colleges. So it's CUNY, it's New York City Housing Authority, it's Port Authority, MTA. So it's not just going to be the city, it's going to have to be the authorities.
Let me
as
ask
well.
a question before. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to just quickly say, I mean, again, I'm a little bit of a one-note wonder on this Move New York plan, but that's just my advocacy specialty. But, you know, this is a plan. This is an example of something where, unfortunately, we do need to get approval through legislative, enabling legislation in Albany. But ultimately, this is a plan where
We
we're
have to get
asking.
enabling legislation in Albany if we want to set our speed limit, if we
Exactly.
want to have traffic lights, if we want to set our minimum wage, if we want to tax our own people for pre-K. I mean, we have to do.
Exactly.
We can't do anything.
So
without
this is not,
Albany
this is
saying,
not
"Hey."
unique in that sense, but this is an example of where we're asking users of infrastructure in the New York City region to pay for that, to help
bear
pay for
more
that
of the burden.
infrastructure, and therefore to reinvest in the same infrastructure that we're all benefiting from. So it is very much kind of local spending, local kind of imposition of user fees, and then taking that revenue to spend on those same folks.
I would just say this question is very timely because tomorrow is the opening of the consolidated financing applications where all of the New York localities begin the process of assembling their applications for state funding from a broad variety of programs, both state and federal. And These are programs that cover everything from the revitalization of Main Street mixed-use corridors to funding for the hard costs for infrastructure financing to long-term sustainability planning. And I think some good questions are raised about the amount of revenue that is actually lost within New York City and then has to be recovered when that money then goes back out and have to bring it back into the city. On the other hand, I'd also say that some of the planning that has to be done really has to be done on a regional level, especially infrastructural planning. And so there's a logic to having to have pools of money that are assembled by the state to be available to cities that are working cooperatively as part of a larger regional strategy. So I think it's a tricky question. It's a highly political question, but it is a system that we have. And so we are all working on it until June 16th when the applications are due. So.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Michael Tal. I'm from Lehman College, and my question is, as New York City continues to repair and expand its infrastructure, to what extent will green technology play a role in that, and is it more feasible to just stick to traditional technology?
Well, I don't think the law allows you to stick to what you're calling traditional technology. I mean, obviously, energy costs are a mammoth part of running our lives, and green technology to that degree is certainly cost effective, I think, as has been proved. Does anybody know specifically on green issues?
I think one specific example is New York City. Every year there's 27 billion gallons of sewage and rainwater overflow. We can't treat it in our water treatment plants, so it's dumped directly into New York City Harbor. That's pretty disturbing, 27 billion gallons. Initially, we were going to address that exclusively with retention tanks or expanding our wastewater treatment plants. Instead, we're starting to invest in green roofs, green streets, swales, so that the water is absorbed on the street or on properties rather than before it goes into the
Put to beneficial use.
And in fact, some of the proposals for post-Sandy sustainability and resilience include green methods of controlling water coming over our seawalls, or increasingly insufficient seawalls because of the big, because of the rises of the sea level, which will suck up a great deal of that water before it wipes out NYU Hospital, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but the other thing about that, and I'm glad you asked the question, is that we can reduce our need for additional infrastructure by being more efficient. And green, is, amongst other things, means that. So we now are operating in excess of 100% capacity for our electrical grid. The way to avoid having to build more capacity is to use less electricity per person. That's another version of green. Same thing with water.
I would also add, in terms of the requirements for these state grants, that green regulations and sustainability guidelines are a part of so many of them that you'd have to be crazy to not develop your plans and proposals in conformity with the innovations that are available in clean tech. So I think there is the economic piece, but I also think there's the shift from a regulatory perspective, and with regard to the guidelines for being able to be eligible for both federal and for state grants. The incentive is also there to develop projects that are using green tech.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Pauline Alberison. I'm from Queens College, and I have the following question. We recently saw the effect of a gas explosion in Harlem. To what extent are more inspections in older buildings necessary to prevent future tragedies?
In what sense is overbuilding, did you say? No.
Older buildings, yes.
Unfortunately, what happened in Harlem, I've covered, again, as a reporter, steam pipes exploding. How often do we see water mains exploding and screwing up traffic all over town? The Harlem situation was just horrendous. I mean, because eight people died, and but it was a reflection of the age of the mains, and and repairing those, upgrading those, not only saves money, it saves lives.
Yeah, and I think 2 points. One is, you're absolutely right, the infrastructure is old. More than 50% of our gas mains are over 50 years old. Over 50% are made of cast iron or bare steel, which is more prone to leaks. But the other point you made I think is really critical, is we often think of infrastructure and utilities as these centralized regulated companies, these big behemoths, the Con Eds, the national grids. But in fact, the last 100 feet is in old buildings, and that's up to the landlords or house owners to take care of those. Whether it's the water mains, whether it's your internet, whether it's gas, those are the responsibility of landowners, and especially in old buildings, and especially in affordable housing, where the landlords often aren't covering their capital costs. So you see in these areas with affordable housing in poor areas, the buildings are especially dilapidated. You're seeing lead pipes and pipes that don't do a good job conveying the utilities, and those are the ones that are prone. I think we need to be reinvesting and make sure that homeowners are taking care of their buildings.
Let me try to get another question in.
Hi, my name is Jonah Garnick, and I'm a sophomore at Hunter College. With many other cities around the world, such as Hong Kong or Singapore, with much newer infrastructure, do you think the aging infrastructure of New York City threatens our position in the urban global competitiveness and competitive sphere?
Well, I would just say absolutely yes. I mean, I think if you can't move the city's people around and give them the best possible access to jobs that are being created in the region, you're going to hurt the city's economy. I know that the Partnership for New York City, probably about 6 years ago, did a study, and they looked at the issue of congestion and not having updated transportation infrastructure, and determined that that is costing us, or the congestion is costing us, about $13 billion a year, in terms of lost economic
the airports.
opportunity.
In particular, our airports are not as accessible as they ought to be, and the airports themselves are in severe need of
Overcrowded, and the roads to get you there are overcrowded as well.
and the lack of a transit infrastructure. Although I will say the train to the plane out to Kennedy, which I've taken, and to Newark, is remarkably easy.
It's like it's a New York arrogance. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, but we can't continue to think that because we're New York, it's okay for some of our core infrastructure to be not as good as the cities we're competing with.
But we're tougher.
We
Oh,
are
I'm sorry,
tougher.
I'm sorry.
That's true.
And you talk about the NIMBYism of New Yorkers. I think sometimes they're too status quo oriented. There's no connection to LaGuardia. Why is there no connection to LaGuardia? Because the NQ extension that could have gotten there would have gone over 5 blocks of residential area.
Well, those people have to live somewhere. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Norris James. I'm from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And my question is, very interesting ideas so far on where we need to, on the importance of infrastructure development. So my question is, where do we start? And the second question is, who makes the decision as to where to start? And for the panelists, what specific project would you undertake first?
It's a good question. I mean, who decides is the government, the city, the state, the Port Authority, the MTA, the various governing, the kind of alphabet soup of governing authorities. But I want to ask, since we only have a couple of minutes left, what would you do first? And because the $47 billion, $47.3 billion, as outlined in the Center for an Urban Future report, is really to kind of stabilize what we have without talking about what we really need going forward. Additionally, what don't we have that we ought to be investing in? So, but, what would you do first? So,
well, you know what I would do first.
I know what you would do.
But actually, in all honesty,
Yeah, but these moves us all, allows us to get.
Yeah, and I think our transportation system is vital, and also, one of the things.
It's the capillaries that keep everything.
Yes,
going.
exactly. And I think it's really, when you think about Mayor de Blasio's Vision Zero plan, which is to minimize the number of pedestrian, bicycle, and other fatalities and injuries on our city streets, and you also think about the kind of our desire to close the inequality gap, I think investing in mass transit is a very good way to do that. I mean, you're asking a very small percentage of the city's people to pay a little bit more than they're paying now, because they're paying nothing. And in return, you get the money necessary to invest in a system that 80 to 85% of the region's people, particularly its low and middle income people, depend on to move around, to get to their jobs, to go to places of worship, et cetera. So I think since this is one of the few obvious things that we can do, and I don't think that the answers are all as easy for some other parts of infrastructure, I think we should start where we can, and certainly something like fair tolling
the fact that we,
is a good place to start.
Hopefully we can do more than one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So I mean, what would you do first, and what's missing from the report in the sense of looking ahead?
I think the question's interesting, what to do first, and the real problem is the city doesn't know what to do is first. The city does a terrible job capital planning. we're supposed to have this what's called an AIM support area investment, asset investment strategy where we assess every single piece of infrastructure and we determine how much it needs and prioritize how to spend. It's about a 14,000-page document that nobody looks at and it's not integrated
I'm not going to
into our
read that.
capital
I read
planning.
the- I
Don't
read
read
your
that one,
report.
and no one reads it, and that's the problem. We need to have a better system of prioritizing what we're going to invest in, and we don't. We need a better long-term strategy.
But what's missing? If you spent, if Michael Bloomberg said, okay, I got the 47 billion, I'll give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Now you fixed everything up. What would you then take all this money we're going to raise? What would you do going forward? What are we missing?
Yeah, I think improving outer borough transit is probably the top priority for me. So whether that's using the abandoned LIR lines, whether that's better through running, so New Jersey transit lines go through to LIR or Metro North, whether that's expanding the G to Forest Hills. I think there's a lot of options in terms of improving interborough, outer borough transit, and that's not happening right now.
What would you want to see done?
Believe it or not, actually, I think the Move New York proposal is what we need to do, but you want something more specific than
No. I'm not going to tell you what this is.
I think I'm going to agree with my colleague here and say that we really need to fix our skewed pricing mechanisms for all these transportation modes. But in terms of specific projects, outer borough transportation, and it makes no sense to build 1/3 of the 2nd Avenue subway and stop there.
1/4.
1/4. We must build the other pieces of it so it connects to the Lexington Avenue subway all the way up at 125th and goes all the way down to the Lower East Side, and then do outer borough transit. Those two projects are probably the most important. But by the time we finish those, LaGuardia will be even more of an embarrassment. So that's got to be in my triumvirate.
Well, they used to say that the highway to heaven will be built before the train to the plane, but now we do have the train to the plane. So maybe we actually have the will and the means to get some of this done. We're out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us on the CUNY Forum. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Spirited discussion.